begin by congratulating Aswar. I think the Nutshell Forum is playing a very important role um, in the space of providing an institutional mechanism for regular convening and bringing leaders together and fostering dialogue. And he's been doing it consistently. I've seen the institution grow, and I want to commend you and congratulate you for all your efforts. And I was very glad to see colleagues from Martin Dow support the Nutshell Forum. I know the Mr. late Jawad Khani, whose young children now represent him so ably and support initiatives like this. He would be very proud of you if he was alive today. Thank you for supporting public events. I've been asked to say something about women empowerment, and I was wondering what I would say. I don't have the luxury anymore of preparing speeches. There's just so much going on. There's so much that you have to look after. And as I was driving over this morning, I was thinking of what I was going to say to you, and I thought maybe I would start off by outlining the context in which we are having this discussion on women's empowerment and women's role in the economy and women's role to fuel growth. And I think that there are three contexts which are very important. The first context relates to the overarching environment in which we operate. We know from lessons around the world that wherever countries invest in education, wherever in a sovereign context the societal fabric is stronger, wherever law and order, peace and justice is upheld, wherever there are countries which govern their populations better, where institutions are strong, where social sector investments are made, populations outcomes are better and they are also better distributed. So I think that is the first context that we have to be mindful of. We cannot divorce this discussion on the role of women and their status in the society and their contribution to the economy from that broader picture. The challenges that are out there within that context are in front of you. The opportunities that are out there, I'm sure you had a discussion on that. So that's the first context. The second context relates to what I would refer to as a very ironic paradox in Pakistan when it comes to the role of women in the society. Because on the one hand, Pakistan has scores very highly in terms of the participation of women in the parliament. But on the other hand, you can say that this is an extension of elite capture and of feudal and patriarchal norms. And on one hand, we can boast that because of Pakistan's consistent investments in higher education, we have almost achieved gender parity in numeric terms in higher education, in terms of participation of women in higher education, in terms of college enrollment, in terms of university enrollment. But then on the other hand, when you look at female literacy, because I deal with the districts of Kohistan and Bashu and Chahi, and when you look at the rates of female literacy there, they're really abysmal, and that again is a paradox. On the other hand, I also see a paradox because today a Pakistani woman, many of us here, operate in an environment where there is freedom of speech, where there's freedom of expression, where there's freedom of what, in terms of what we wear, in terms of what arts we promote, in terms of what culture we promote, in terms of who we engage with. There are no systemic constraints to the participation of women in economic life in the way that there are in the Middle Eastern countries, for example. I recall the only time I had to take my husband's permission to go somewhere when I had to apply for a visa to go to Saudi Arabia, and that was really a shock for me. And the only time I was segregated from not sitting in a men's row was in that part of the world. So from that perspective, nobody stops you from sitting next to one another. Nobody stops you from wearing what you like. Nobody stops you from going to a cafe. And there are women like you and me who enjoy freedoms under the law of the land, which we must appreciate. But then, on the other hand, we have to be painfully mindful of the fact that there are women in vast swaths of land in this sovereign territory where societal behaviors, where certain patriarchal norms, perpetrate the worst kinds of abuses, pave the way for the worst kinds of discrimination and violence. And there again, there is a paradox. So I see this ironic paradox as far as the status of women is concerned in our country, when it comes to education, when it comes to participation in political life, when it comes to rights and privileges, and of course you can extend the argument to employment. On the one hand, we have, at least at the mid-career level, a high percentage of women in formal jobs, but on the other hand, you have domestic workers who are not even recognized. You have women whose work is seen as an extension of their domestic responsibility in rural areas and in environments where men do nothing but spend all their time in local cafes in the villages, excuse my saying so, but that is a fact. So this country with its diversity, and there is beauty in this diversity, but there is also irony in that, this diversity. And I think any conversation on the role of women in economic life, you cannot divorce from this diversity and in this opportunity. In fact, when the Global Gender Parity Report was launched in 2017, Pakistan ranked at the rock bottom. We ranked at 143 out of 144. But I think averages hide a lot of inequities. So if we were to disaggregate those numbers, we would see the good and the bad, and the ugly. So that is the second context. And then the third context is the context of human capital development. Because today we know from data, from evidence, from numbers, from studies, from hard evidence, from global institutional frameworks, that the real wealth of a country is not its physical wealth, it's not its environmental wealth, it's not its capital, it is its human resource. In fact, studies tell us that 60% of the wealth of a country is contributed by, today, and in the economy of the future, will be contributed by the capacity of its human resource. 60% of the developed countries and 40% in the developing countries. And therefore, the future of the developing world will rest on how fast, how efficiently, how effectively they can invest in their human resource capacity and capital development. And in that regard, we have to remember and recognize that the census of 2017 has told us that 48.9% of the population of this country is comprised by women. So you cannot possibly aspire to compete in the world of today, even today, and certainly in the world of tomorrow, unless you invest in half your population is. In fact, women's equality is a great barrier to prosperity. We know from data and evidence that it deprives national economies of women's talents, their skills, their productive potential, their leadership acumen. We know that excluding women from the economic mainstream will curtail tax yields. And we know from our work in the social sector that when you don't invest in women's education, it is a sure recipe for poor social and economic indicators. So clearly the rationale for that is very clear. The question is, how do you go forward in a country as diverse as this? How do you proceed forward? And what does economic empowerment of women mean in today's day and age? As I shared with you, I'm just coming from the board meeting of BIS, and two eminent colleagues who just joined me here. We were discussing the agenda of financial inclusion for women. We were discussing the agenda of how to give women savings accounts and to use the power of the digital world and free time on the media and the government's footprint in districts and tehsils to invest in financial literacy. So gone are those times when we used to talk about women and their welfare in terms of maternity homes and in terms of protection against domestic violence. The world has really gone forward, and we really have to capitalize on this wave. We must create the right institutional frameworks to be able to draw on those. So what is the way forward? if you really are serious in tapping the potential of women and making sure that they're mainstream, and if we're serious, we have to start with data. We must mandate data disaggregation at every level. Pakistan invests heavily in surveys. There's a number of different population-based surveys, the social and living standards measurement surveys, the multiple indicator cluster surveys. You have a whole Bureau of Statistics crunching up numbers. The default is that you will give national averages and you will give the rural and average urban figures. It's important that we disaggregate data by gender because averages hide a lot of inequities. The second thing is that we must structurally invest in creating the right accountability mechanisms. I'm involved in a number of global initiatives where we're looking at the participation of women in the workforce through a very structural means, where you look at evidence, you look at the practices of institutions, you use big data analytics and artificial intelligence to pick up data from various sources, you triangulate, you look at trends, but then you pass on those data to independent entities which will act as watchdogs, and that piece is missing. If we're serious about mainstreaming the role of women, then we have to develop those analytical capacity and strategically invest in those watchdogs which will be our ears and eyes. Thirdly, we must understand where the barriers are. And in terms of the barriers, at the cost of maybe not too over-generalizing, I would like to segregate the formal from the informal sector. So for the informal sector, there is a huge basket of problems. It's been reported that Pakistan, as I've already said, that Pakistan really lags behind in terms of the participation of women in the workforce. And I would argue that the work of a lot of women is not accounted for. So in the urban areas, a lot of women who work as domestic workers are working in the informal sector. Women in the rural settings, their work is seen as an extension of their domestic work. When they look after livestock, when they work in the fields, that is considered to be an extension of their domestic work. They are not registered in social security systems. In any case, our social security systems are fragmented. There is a long list of exclusions, and these women in the informal sector, both in the rural and urban settings, are completely excluded. Then, of course, you come to the urban areas, and in the urban areas, of course, all of us have the double burden syndrome of catering to responsibilities at home and of course trying to pursue aggressive careers. And there are male and female gender stereotypes which we have not been able to break. That is a significant barrier. Another significant barrier is the lack of mentoring opportunities. So there are young mid-career women who want to progress. We really don't have opportunities to play, institutional opportunities to place them for mentoring or their capacity building. The ecosystems are not there to support women. I distinctly recall a visit to the Sialkot Chamber of Commerce, and a group of women came to me who were entrepreneurs, and one of them was making gloves for Servonetta gloves, and she showed me a balance sheet, she showed me what she was able to do, she told me where she traveled, but then she also told me what her chamber was able to do for her in terms of building capacity for accounts and how to access a lawyer, how to access an accountant, how to balance your books, how to book travel, how to navigate the export space. And she had that opportunity to be mentored, and she lamented to me and said that my sister lives in Faisalabad and she wants to be as entrepreneurial as I am, but she doesn't have the opportunity because the same mentoring, because the same ecosystem and the mentoring ability does not exist. So the opportunity to mentor women is very important. The opportunity to make sure that they are twinned with women who are further along in their careers and to institutionally support that, I think is fundamental to their success at a particular point in their careers, to make sure that they are effectively, from the protection, from the safety, from the harassment perspective, that they're protected from those dimensions, and that agencies are taken into account on those notes is fundamentally important to their thriving in the workspace. So the dimensions of where we have to start from, and in both areas we have to start from a long way back, in the rural and urban areas is quite different. And these assessments were basically the setting for the policy initiatives which have been launched under the program of SAS, which I'm sure some of you must be aware about. This is, I think, one of the most aggressive and wide-ranging poverty alleviation programs ever launched in the country. It's a program with a multifaceted aspiration. Its aspiration is to lift the lagging areas. Its aspiration is to lift the people who have been left behind and to invest in human capital development. And when I had the privilege of leading the deliberations to design this program as an independent person, working with the poverty, with what is called the Poverty Council, constituted by the Prime Minister, we had these constraints in mind, and gender weaves through the core of the SAS program. As I already mentioned, and of course Yusuf Saab is one of the experts on the consulting teams. In fact, in the SAS program, there are 4 pillars, and each one of them cuts through the core of gender equality. The first pillar is about making the government more pro-poor, more equal, and ensuring that we dilute this aspect and eliminate the aspect of capture, of elite capture of the current functioning of the government. There are 25 policy initiatives outlined under that. And as I mentioned right at the very beginning, it all goes back to how a country functions. And if the overarching rubric is pro-equity, then of course it works for outcomes generally, and you see outcomes that are better distributed. So that's the first pillar of SAS, with women empowerment very much at the heart of it. The second pillar of SAS relates to social protection, and there women are at the heart of it, because we are aiming for the financial inclusion of more than 6 million women. We aspire to develop more than 500 information technology-enabled hubs, exploiting synergy with programs and primetime television to make women aware about their rights and entitlements, especially from the financial inclusion perspective, especially from the jobs and skills perspective. And all the other policy initiatives that are outlined for women in that second pillar under the rubric of safety nets mandates that there should be an equal accrual of benefits to both men and women, to the extent of making sure that they have co-ownership of houses that are being partly underwritten by government resources. The third pillar of SAS centers on jobs and livelihoods, and that is where a number of new initiatives are being launched, including a series of solutions innovation challenges focused on the lagging areas, and there women will be at the heart of the agenda as well. And finally, the last piece of it is human capital development, which by default centers around women in so many different endpoints. So I just want to emphasize that, of course, it's important that we start structurally, that we recognize that there is a problem, that we recognize that this is a very large country with many paradoxes. There is a system that works well for women like us, but there is a system that does not work for women, but that we should try and capitalize on the opportunities. We must insist on data mining in ways that will make the gender differences more visible, more pronounced. We must structurally make sure that the right entities and women's groups are supported so we can draw on those data for advocacy arguments that will call for policy change. That we start, as we did, by looking at the barriers both for women in the formal and the informal sectors, and then come up with a plan as we have in the shape of SRs with 115 policy initiatives and 4 pillars. Of course, the proof of the pudding is in its eating. Having things on paper is not what makes a difference. It is how efficiently and effectively this program will be implemented, which will be the proof of its success. We are currently in the very initial phase of its implementation. And perhaps in another 6 months from now, when I have another invitation from Asper, I can come tell you a little bit more about how things are. Thank you very much for the privilege of having me.